1. Robin Wayne, 526 West 152nd Street, New York, New York 10031. robinner@yahoo.com. robinner@verizon.net. 21286200905. Stream of Consciousness by Robin Wayne. To begin this stream of consciousness, I draw from the experience of leading an adult literacy group to explore the open-ended questions that were most influential in our discussions. I would like to begin by the conclusions we discovered about ourselves in regards to the missing elements that were left to us without the proper perspective when acting by will, or intention in such a manner to achieve our desired purpose. When understanding that we are subjects of observable behavior, to include the emotional response that begins with an underlying motive. The question of recurrent themes that were formed either by disappointment, or by the response, actions, and reactions that defined our characteristics were of no great choice of our own. These questions had at least surfaced in our assessments, by our mutual consent that we were not at fault, while all measures seemed to point to the fact that we were. In our table of inquiry into self-expression, we examined our tools of literacy as a real need to adapt our behavior to a world of letters that fell as an empty bottom in our pursuits of higher ambition. At this juncture, we saw that our emotional behavior was unduly established as a reaction to those elements that we were in defense of. It was the sheer one-sided view or single-mind purpose that had stood in the way of our need for self-expression. How then could we address this predicament into a legitimate proposal with work in the literary world? Were our opening questions, as we agreed, had left us too hurt or constrained to open our vision to the clear purpose of established critical thinking as our main objective? The clarity that was established by the method we reached was that we would have a classroom discussion as an open forum that could include the humble testaments of what had been our digressions, almost as an autobiographical account of the issues we needed to address concerning this purpose, which we had worked so hard in achieving, but which at this point whose meaning was elusive. The questions we asked were very general and very naturalistic. Such were our very viewpoints about the nature of the world. In assigning ourselves the very primitive task of assimilating our accountability as a learned behavior that is demonstrated in the form of self-preservation, we began to reconcile with our demons all of the doubt and panic we had had when considering a chapter in our life to be sealed shut like a closed book. My role was in opening this book with the dream that one day they may write it for themselves. We began with a very basic observation that came from a very general discourse on our equality to one another. While some beckoned that there were no justifiable reasons why they would not have the same gift of reading material that they were fond of as anyone else. On the same note, there were no more excuses for not committing ourselves to the task. As we began with a free association in telling our stories in a very general way, we became closer acquainted with the literary metaphors that seemed to place our lives in perspective to create a structure. Our goal for now was to acquaint ourselves with the linguistic style that we expressed ourselves with, the understanding that our prior experience had not betrayed our interest in this self-preservation. Our assertions grew from our benevolence in a way that we felt touched with an emotional handicap. While we praised the level of our own maturity, we reconciled that if we didn't use the effort to understand the human condition, then nothing would change. The spoken word had to be enough to ask questions of each other, to share our viewpoints in a way we felt comfortable with. The discipline would come in time as we awaited eagerly for the passion we had in telling our stories to disclose the evidence that we could make use of our fears by applying ourselves to the job of maintaining self-awareness. As we had achieved the result that we sought at some point in the past, whereby, in utilizing this motivational skill, we could show improvement in our strengths and validation that we could rise to the occasion of answering to that hopelessness that our false expectations would subject us to. In living with conditions that defined these circumstances as obsolete, we were discussing real experiences that gave our lives the incentive to move forward, and to carry with us the lessons we learned, that may be attached to an inner sense of wisdom in perspective and proportion. In revealing memories of our lost battles, we drew conclusions of where we may have been at fault. Through argument and agreement, we saw many behavioral patterns that could be defined by the term ego. Our voices were raised to the equal misgivings of possessing a masculine or overtly feminine character trait. This talk proceeded into what I consider to be a quest for knowledge. We needed a catalyst to transform our emotional investments into the formidable evidence that presents itself through discussion. We decided to take a common interest in our self-awareness this time by demonstrating through note-taking those episodes that may have set us off balance. We were also examining the effects of having an altered state of mind, being that our reference to personality conflicts were often one-sided and unfairly represented. The end of our class was in agreement that surely we would gain by removing all of those skeletons we kept buried in the closet, that could reveal how our personality traits could be found in the fictional and non-fictional depictions of careful storytelling. At our meeting a prevailing concern grew amongst my pupils concerning what had prevented them from being tolerant of others in the past. The acceptance and appreciation we had of our stock grew into a whole myriad of accounts of experiences in the formation of the material we gathered. We soon sought after this material, this formidable background, that presented our experiences as quality human beings. The belief or taboo that our self-interest was somehow inherent grew into an empty upheaval of everything we were taught was wrong. It was for our purpose, for the present time, that we listened to the stories of others as our discussion of interwoven themes made our table both a forum, and a conference built on the strengths and weaknesses of identifying with characters in the literary world. As we ourselves possessed a very human quality whose nature was intended to think through issues, and to draw inference from the responses we gathered from others. So many of our encounters were based on seeing through the blind side of episodes that may have been the product of ignorance. Self-righteously we remained at each other's disposal to show how our thought patterns, and patterns of behavior were indicative of moral posture, that while apropos to our discovery of self-indulgent interests, we may have been kept underdeveloped, and even undernourished of our own intellect. The moral dilemmas we faced were based on the pretenses that we felt were forbidden to contradict, and yet these thought patterns derived from a consensus of our small population certainly were of a universal quality by nature. How then should these inferences give rise to voice, and how is voice so much attuned to the spoken word, and yet something that goes beyond that? My group counseling was not conducted to show right and wrong, but to carefully construct our models of behavior from which we could derive clear thinking. Our self-examination of cause and effect at this juncture helped us to elaborate on our self-interest, if only in the mode of our self-preservation, until that beacon of light, or should I say that keen interest in self-appraisal became indicative of a necessary practice. At which point my student began to examine their characters as all being derived from a point of departure that was held from within. I retraced that initial intimidation of putting pen to paper, and asked them to proceed to write their stories, at which a clear account was made of the disappointment of their giving into the temptation to let the drawbacks of the system govern their actions and behaviors. My class began loosening their chains as their hopes, and their voices were raised in an effort to live in a world where they could survive. Their incentive to change the world also became their pejorative after carefully constructing insight on what they had seen was an error, while faced with the drawbacks of having given in too soon. The nature versus nurture theory holds great content for a group that is held under constraint. I was literally feeding this group material based on their prior knowledge and prior experience. The cautionary measures they took in concealing what would otherwise be revealed became less of an issue, as we became open to criticism, while agreement and argument flourished. We observed both the fair criticism, and what was merely counterproductive commenting on our progress. Almost from out of nowhere my group began to stand erect and robustly positioned for response, due to the circumstances of being heard in an open forum. The thought to an emotional integrity restored their self-confidence, as for just that moment our thoughts became as one, and there became less of a need to circumvent our anger and fears, as we placed ourselves in the position to benefit by each other's experience, and we began to celebrate the prosaic form of which our lives take shape. Our bone was picked. Our main conflict presented itself as an imposition of character. It was in finding weaknesses in all those who admired our talent, and the intimidation factor we implemented to get our way. Our conflict was in the definition of what it meant to be human. Would some take credit for this, while others could never make the claim? The standards we had used for self-criticism seemed to dwell in the misconception that we had no reason to give up our fight-or-flight instincts. What had passed down from several generations was a progenitor of kill or be killed. The brutal ways which condescended our sheer misgivings were never shown to be productive, but retroactive as we used sheer strength to firm up our position and take advantage. What did it mean to be a woman, as the voice from the other side cried out? It was in the acceptance of this complete foolhardiness that they grew to tolerate being understood or misunderstood. The depiction of patience as a reputable virtue grew thin in my class, as women could only account for the weaknesses they had observed in the opposite sex. We are the mothers and daughters of a great civilization, whose needs were met by their very words. While others claimed their self-confidence bestowed upon them more ingenuity, as men seemed so naturally reliant upon them for their sensibilities and sensuality. I could look beautiful until the world had no end, were some of the comments, but the women saw past the experience of male domination, and understand that their concept of wisdom came very much from female circles that they depended upon for insight. How could we make a clear definition of self-observation, as a tone ran across the room with a wish for self-forgiveness? The very product of our misgivings had amounted to a sense of pride. We had demonstrated common sense when the goal was to cast us out of self-destruction. There seemed no end to what we were being asked to admit to. The popularity contest had worn thin. We had better start moving or give in to this harsh indifference. Our reality was a different story that ran in the depths of our souls. It was not one of cowardice or envy, but of the calamity of becoming what we had rejected. We had lived on our own self-made island of irrational claims. We were no longer advantaged or disadvantaged. We were alone in a world we never respected, and it was one of rejection that led to a presiding low moral fiber. Who then were we as writers, and who were the writers we may like to think of becoming? Certainly trace elements of assets ran the course of the vocation. A breed of self-confidence, self-assertion, and self-expression. What were our considerations? It didn't matter, it was the voice that came from the pit of our gut which asked us to prove ourselves. Reading and writing became the proving ground beyond the recognition of self-expressive involvement. It became the test to demonstrate the use of will that could not keep us in contempt from denial. It was the only achievement we wished to make, as well as the only contribution. It was the way in which both men and women came closer to being godlike. Writing was the craft that demonstrated the full potential of our being human, and the integrity of our self-awareness as it became self-knowledge. This then was our first orientation that began with what others felt was wrong with our role modeling. It was the stuff of realistic profit that had no monetary value. Our orientation proved to us that we were not alone with our struggles, that to give credence to our voice was a vocation we could no longer overlook. We felt obligated to use the lessons as a place to let our defenses down, and to celebrate the beauty of making keen and introspective observations, based on our own strengths as examples of proper will. We grew in expectations of advanced comprehension, with one major comment that we were not read to as children. What recompense was worthy of my admission and omission of the same condition? I had a dozen offspring who had completed college-level degrees. The point of the lessons would be superfluous if we were aiming to find fault in our childhood. Yet that is what we did, with no explanation needed to be given about the gifts we maintained as our own personal venues. Our rite of passage became a discourse on surviving the tempestuous affairs that would deprive us of honor. Meaning that we had stood up for ourselves, as we welcomed the voice of reason that would suspend our just cause with open arms. The voice of reason was delivered on terms that were acceptable. We began looking into our own heroism, and our own mythology with a means to expressing pride. We had all felt given to situations and circumstances that would mean we owed no apology. The direction of the course was fairly administered in that we did not have to meet the high expectations that were placed on us to unravel irrational and useless rhetoric. I believe the theme that ran most dearly in our work was that had each accomplished a long-term goal that we had set for ourselves. Our interest now was to allow this temperance to branch out into all avenues of our self-seeking. We must find that focal center where our lives unite as one. We had all had characters we felt we had aspired to, from the Prince of Darkness, to the Prince of Thieves, yet our writing who we were at this point if for no other reason than for self-identification gave us the headway, to show us how much concerned with self we actually were. The stories of self-achievement gave us the purpose of categorizing our experience that were internal and eternal. The voice of the past drew no mistake. Nobody was actually asking us to apologize for our behavior, nor was it in our interest to do so. The firm appraisal of self-authorization was beginning to demonstrate how we are creators and also authors of our own affairs, by the account and virtue of how much we concealed, and how much we revealed, given the light of circumstances and what we felt we expected of ourselves at the time. From the written material we had gathered, we had begun to awaken to the spiritual principles of which we had tried to attain. Our incantations drew deeply from our past those reflections we believed are sanctimonious and without restraint. We felt our egos did reveal the knowledge that we have our own lives to live. The material we used was strengthened by a plot summary and the recollection of what had motivated our actions. By understanding some of our forebearers who also had sought to be educated. We felt our guidance and discipline had taken us to this point of origin. We had seen the virtue of good and evil, and we had found we told the stories of our falling somewhere in between. We could imitate gods but we were not God. Our own accounts of our errors proved this, and yet the wheels were turning as we discussed setting and theme. Our imaginations took us to place ourselves in familiar territory. We could not allow others to steer us wrong at this point. We had to get this out, and understand these guiding principles as indicative of our own behavior. The precepts we ascribed to had to contain personal influence, as our affluence was shared by those whose experience with their trials and tribulations had made them think of ourselves in ways nobody else knew. We were the guiding principles of our actions, we only had to implement the right use of judgment in communicating this to others. Our first contributions were of the ordinary time that dispelled our doubts. The displacements of fears of rejection took on non-presuming sides of our emotional integrity. One student could not overlook that he was under the influence of a spell, as the setting he depicted was in light of how he overcame these driving evil spirits. We had not chosen the life we lived for ourselves, but we were choosing those experiences in which there was a trace of humanity to steer us in the direction of our own truth. The messages were not so high and mighty, they were of the preponderance of having a great many and varied feelings. Our characters were of second nature, they were comprised of everything others would have us believe, and that element of truth that we wished to conform to. We were having our own spiritual lifting, when at the dawn of time we had embodied a corporeal claim to our justified human nature. The irony was that these characters had shortcomings of rejection, due to the circumstances that placed them at a disadvantage. We were not going to give in. For our characters to achieve victory they must have an understanding of virtue and vice. The only call of action that was given as our responsibility was to follow through, and to have this depiction of our self-worth be the bedrock upon which we could build monuments of great influence. Our message was clear that since our adventure had begun we must come to terms with these doubts if we were going to learn what attributes to our becoming self-respecting and dignified. The progenitor of man was very much our stories, as we decided to lay it on the level, and show that even heroes must endure extreme tolerance and hardship of which was understood. Our dream was one of interrelatedness, and one of attachment. It was one of atonement and one of a confessional. The emotional side of our development had been cast us in a shadow of immaturity. The circumstances we faced head-on had betrayed us. Our goal was to use this inner conflict that had perpetuated from a self-justified position to understand the intention of authors, the manner in which they allude to the truth, and their depiction of reason that did not contradict our role in society. Our dream was to write lyrically, and with versatility, to sing the muse that had but on the edge of our lips. We welcomed anyone who showed favoritism to literary scholarship, as our stories within stories revealed that mankind was imperfect. Where then did we go wrong in our account of the human condition? Perhaps by accepting the thought that we unequivocal in our hardened position, yet we could not claim that the arrogance of writers was ours to make. The thought that our lives were too short, and had to be addressed as we were right at this moment in reach of all of our material. My position was that we ought to reconcile with this indifference, and practice the basics of grammatical writing. Our style of storytelling was now made apparent, we now had to communicate and voice this auspicious quality that made us into the creators of the written page, and thus of our own destinies. Our challenge as the next rite of passage came in the form of turning a thoughtless rejection of emotion, into a thoughtful testimony of our own needs and self-care. How to be supportive of those whose roles was so eloquently related to their being a public figure. This began with the admission that our intended purpose was never realized. To begin to attend to our needs of self-preservation, and to focus on a train of thought became my only ambition and sole purpose in leading the group, as we were beginning, with clarity to assess each other's intent and voice in writing. We observed strengths and weaknesses of character, and mind that were not always self-evident. This sheer use of the will was an ironclad proposition with a caution, that we needed to adhere to, and prepare for our understanding to demonstrate humble service of the spoken, the written word, and the listening ear. This we attributed to with the highest regard as we began to ask questions of the evidence that helped our experiences to grow and take root. Family support was one theme we each touched on, while understanding our ambivalence in making such progress was another. As we became witnesses of each other's testimony, an unspoken peace came about the room. A peace that revealed our being prophetic as well as wise in regards to our discernment of how much we would either reveal or conceal. For our group purpose, mankind was fallible. This was an issue that needed to be addressed and amended before we could claim we showed integrity as writers. Yet, how could we defend ourselves against the tirade of whirling emotion, having been backed into a corner by our worst enemies? As concern for this matter grew on dependency, we had to organize out thought for them to construct an orientation. This began an in-depth look to give rise to the voice of an inner child who saw matters clearly and innocently. If man was fallible, how would we begin to address these wrongs? How then would we take up our crosses with defense in regards to the sin of his own omission? This was our sensitive corner, that did not account for our acquired knowledge. This was the air, water, and food that helped man become creator of his own destiny. Mankind, some agreed, will never equal the works of an omnipotent and unseen power and voice. Yet, mankind will continue to be the creators for which all understanding is met. How then would we yarn through what was so clearly indicative as proof, and transform it into a creation of our own demise? The presence was less mystifying as we in the group possessed the skill to alliterate and decipher our motives with the proofs of our own account. It was in this delivery that we enacted the role of skilled craftsmanship who could demonstrate that we had been in control of our self-will and ego. It was this stuff with which all men were made, to be the living creation and testimony of that which he attributed to his integrity, honor and privilege, as spoken and fashioned so eloquently in words as his prosaic interest would desire. In order to achieve the results we sought in drawing conclusion, there had to be a motivation that was free of inhibition. The quality of life which we pursued was one that gave precedence to those thoughts and ideas which were achieved to reach a common good. The moral fiber that seemed to resonate with the most strength was one of a dismissal of the justification of our victimization. The more we accepted phrases like being sick and tired of being sick and tired, the more we understood our intolerance of irrational proposals. The human heart sings of its mystery to less obvious heroes who make us saddened and feel joy. The quality of life was one of victory over the self-defeating voice that helped us to accept failure. While it was in acceptance of all the conditions that made us individuals. The harmony in rising above the digression of an impoverished heart, lyrically addressed the fundamental principle of our becoming better acquainted with each other, and our own disposition. This acquaintanceship perhaps was the stringing together of voice of those who sought to aspire to the real conviction that we were all masters of our fate, meaning we would have to do twice the work that most of us had already gone through. More in terms of the muse in which these voices did carry in harmony. We drew further from our conclusions about the quality of the souls, and the moral fiber that would consist of the essence of life. The emotional integrity that comprised so much of our determination were one of self-expression, and taking a risk at disclosing personal issues for the sake of its positive effect and influence. To say it, a real romance and passion had to be developed with our use of words. The spoken and written phrase was there to commiserate this experience that we would otherwise be afraid of, as I found myself leading us out of a tunnel of darkness to enter the chink of light as a saving grace of our own humanity. In fact, the essence of life was found in our ability to rejoice and celebrate the sensuous pleasure that made our stories unique and gave call to rejoice in our individuality. We were expecting little, but the payoff was great, as our just rewards for being keepers of our souls showed the generous description of a wide range of feelings, that bordered on anger, fear, sadness, loneliness, displeasure and pleasure. Two unique voices were heard the loudest. The first being of a brotherhood that only spoke from experience. More difficult as it became to penetrate the intellect, the maturity of this union seemed at ease with finding fault in others. We put our minds and hearts together for this chorus, as a general consensus agreed that we must feel pain to learn from our being human. That we must learn from our mistakes, but not from what comes easily. By holding the hand of, and holding to the light, the times a student tried to prove a point, but felt weakness rise by his own misfortune, we discovered something special about our thoughts and actions, that it was we who were willing to take the risks. This implied too that it was we who also had to pay the consequences for our states of mind, and the conduct of placing our needs above everything else, with the understanding that being of service is the process of learning about ourselves, by listening to others. In addition, a feminist voice made clear that their incentive was to face denigration, of all superficial circumstance that deprived them of feeling self-worth. That masculinity never delivered what it promised, since that was not the intention of those who rise above their agreements as scapegoats. The essence of life was not in the charm, but in the spirit of a mix of maternal nature and nurture of it. The clear thinking of preparedness made the rational inquiry one of which great testimony was spoken of. The contributions of those who upheld the virtue of offering praise for a job well done, was in itself all of the respect and pride that one could hope to achieve. The advancement of the student's intellect depended on the examples heard of conflict resolution by our feminist voice. Our group was forming a permeable membrane, and a common bond. Almost through osmosis was the intuition that we ourselves had set on the course of our going human. The feeling of appraisal was built on encountering our intuitions, as we did not justify or offer opinions of what we observed in one another, thus gave rise to the circumstances that had helped us to redefine our gifts, talents, and skills. At this point the learning disabled were truly the gifted and talented learners who could account for the tasks they had achieved, with or without the need to convince others of their appropriateness. Our common sense was earning our diplomacy as it was based on the very merit of our using the English language. We had discovered for ourselves, in doing this, that we had, or were given the skills to communicate effectively exactly what that calling was, to show versatility in our approach to learning literacy. While the method seemed to come from a long discussion that was based on inductive and deductive reasoning, we stood at the proving grounds. Our inquiry into progress made us ask the question if our use of English was now reliable. Were we reassured that we could describe in detail the character strengths that comprised of our personalities? Were we able to resolve issues by describing the cause and effect of events of our past? Could we rely on the reassurance that we had acquired knowledge and skill from the intent to relate on the written page those dramatic episodes that were most relevant in our experience? Was our English a resource for our bravery and courage, that we could utilize as a means of transferring emotion of our departure into risk-taking and meeting challenges? The answer invariably was up to our own incentive as to the method in which we would use our communication to become authors of a fine diction. Our discussion transferred to the symbolic, and the idolatry that we were smashing. By giving all our power to a solid object, we had dismissed the opportunity for understanding and compassion. How then would our skill in writing these passages account for our moral disposition, that we believed in humanity, but were placed in a position of denial due to our own undertaking? The self-assurance that we had come close to in acceptance of conditions was our starting point and ultimate goal. Who could we say contradicted that we maintained the ability to learn from others the nature of our own calamity? We based our self-inquiry not on the idols for which we used to undermine our progress, but on the prudence that we were working and being taught about dignity, by hearing criticism of each other in a way that would help us to explore and discover fresh avenues of insight. It was in this that we felt the perfection of an imperfect being, which pointed to our own self-appraisal as individuals. Our departure led to a letting go of a misconception and perception. We quickly saw how we should direct our focus on places where the quality of our life was appreciated. This almost near-fatal encounter with rejection had to be addressed before we were to pick up the torch, and stop carrying our agony like a doormat for others to stand on. We were in jeopardy of losing our faith to a zealous intention. We did not have to accept this indignation that sought to compromise our integrity. Our discussion turned to the blind, and when we felt we had been duped, by subjecting ourselves to conditions that we did not relate to. When really we were asking for help, we were shown a manner of compromise that did not warrant our making progress. We were at a stalemate, and had to search deeply for the resolution as to whom should take this responsibility. It was ours by fair acquisition, so we had to work with our linguistic skills to construct in our lives a shield of wisdom that would prove to be our honor. By our own determinations we concluded that our problems erupted with community and society. With society we had our day of becoming pawns of the game. With community we knew of no other experience other than deeply seated competition. We defended our right not to live in a fantasy. Our preconceived notions of who wanted what for the sake of desire did not hold water. There were times when we enjoyed being in a losing battle, since those were the conditions we were accustomed to. We could not place our understanding of self-awareness on third parties who compromised our individual assets. Still, while the water was boiling, we encountered our set of values, and our set of values that were not meant to be understood as humor. Our need to determine for ourselves the progress of our human conduct based on a moral system became indicative of how much progress we were willing to make. The choice was ours: do we proceed like a steam engine annihilating everything that stood in our way, or do we proceed with the sound judgment that moral values are based on human conduct? Our roles in how we perceived the decision-making process depended on our insight as to how to amend our indifference to a great deal of what discredited our motive for success. To phrase it as an argument, the very elements we felt ashamed of, we could view as the perception that others had of themselves who did not practice such prudence. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. We determined the source that set up this imbalance to come from a human disposition of insecurity, since we could not account for the expectations that others had of us. We would be believing in lies if every account of our personality defects were taken personally. As we found this forgiveness of ourselves with no excuses as to our motives, we could forgive at least the circumstances we came into conflict with. Since we have developed a careful understanding of the fundamentals of our own oppression, it is essential here to discuss our suppression and repression as the psychodynamic that represented the obstacle in our achieving results. To contradict each statement that came our way, by forming a negative response to that which was almost universal, was not in our interest. Almost as with taboo, we were held in custody to reject any argument that contradicted our common sense. to understand that to be motivated we had a drive and an incentive to meet this persecutor of our reasons, to confirm our passionate and expressive nature. We had to find the real joy, in our lives, our maturity, and our desires. We could not just work at tasks like slaves that were devoid of meaning. Our discussions opened up the possibility of living passionate lives. One that experienced both love and war, and one that was not necessarily subject to right and wrong. Our goal was to use this possession of desire and fulfillment, and this need to attain it, to fine-tune it from a place of subjectivity, so that we could show to the group that being emotional was an aspect of our character traits that drew our actions closer to the life we had imagined for ourselves. We could no longer exclude human emotion, as a great zeal took over that made us view our desires, not only as something that must be shared but something that must come into our portfolio of writing material, that was based on images, projections and a clarity in our aim of what we had been trying to achieve. Still we felt weakened by the thought of those we had hurt. When a verdict of guilty was spelled as clean as day, we felt deprived of the subliminal infatuations that sought new attractions and new passions. This fear then began as an inhibition, one that taught us that masculine and feminine charm was held by its resilience to emotion. How then could we become fluent in English as a newfound language of love? We began by introducing in agreement those commonalities we held in identification. If having been overtly misunderstood for the time we could afford others, while our own interests were proofs of our being self-centered and egocentric, then this suppression of our passions had completed its aim. We asked if beauty was something in and of itself. Some felt the integrity of the group as a forum of discussion contained a beauty. Others saw the value in learning lessons of cause and effect to contain its own virtue and beauty. Some even viewed the consequences of actual intimacy to be a beauty they would never wish to be removed. We knew beauty by its forming of unions in partnership. By an instinctual agreement, the group was asked if there was one great truth that took supremacy over all the rest. It was then we started forming our own meditation, on attraction, affection, eternity, passion, and love. The purpose was to remove the toxins of our guilt, to show to my class that we had attempted to construct whole lives based on profound images and thoughts. The interaction grew less in competition, and more open to thoughts of peace, freedom, equality and justice. A member of the class commented on how there truly was a love supreme. To point to a topic we discussed, who was responsible for suppressing our emotions. After several attempts at looking at punishment as a crime in itself, or the makeup of the system, and the fear of self-expression, we admitted that we did not understand these emotions, since we had never taken action to understand their effects at others. It was in this class that many of our first poetic attempts to find the meaning of love transpired. Some said it was pure, some said it was learned in our youth, almost all agreed that true love was such a powerful experience that we could never owe an apology for it. In reading a few passages on the fountain of youth, and one on a secret but potent elixir, we agreed we wanted the feeling never to end. In a non-judgmental way they regarded their own inhibition of sexuality as a compromise that was incomplete. I speculated we may have been seeing that when one person believes that they are God, that this egocentric behavior involves the world gravitating towards, and around them. As we sought to express ourselves less in the form of magical experiences, we started to understand the initiation rites that seemed indicative of each sexual relationship. The phobia of having to conform to celibacy in our repression we viewed as a mild form of castration. In light of the fact that we were understanding the deep phenomenon of what is inferred by our seeking pleasure, men's victories and setbacks could be seen in resolving conflicts through a power struggle. The interest in wishing to dominate a given situation or a third party was not alien to us. The individual brings to society a blank slate, and a self-interest in correcting his mistakes. As individuals our views of society may have been altered by the tirade of forces that drew us further into rebellion. Could it be said that to create stereotypes, or create conversation of our flowing juices explained how each of us became culprits based on the error of our ways? It was enough to say we had satisfied a role in the way our lives took form, yet to engage in society to win the cash and prizes was mistaken for a game. We confessed we were defeated by our rejection of moral judgment, but this did not preclude our view that society makes waste of human integrity. It just meant that our priorities were elsewhere when asked to provide evidence as to the contributing factors of our own enterprise, or even investment in the value of our own efforts. We could understand the sin of chastisement, and biased circumstances which oppressed our brothers and sisters, but we could not afford the rationalization that we were getting what we deserved. The lifestyles that we viewed with an immoral disposition took the form of how crime was easy, and how organized crime perpetrated all acts of rebellion. We were not as easily defined by the lyrics of a song, or what the group classified as poster boys who were blessing the public with a new lie about the lives of the rich and famous. Our roles in society had to be distinct. Most of us defended the fact that we had a clean, careful, and meticulous upbringing. That we were able to establish premises that understood right and wrong, and that these securities, be they of jealousy or envy, pride or deceit, were well within our grasp of our own experience. So then, what statement of values did we wish to contribute? Perhaps it was one of giving in too soon, or of the misguided principle that had clearly shown how others who were esteemed with as much if not more potential were as likely to digress and take the wrong path. Our views were of pride primarily, that we could survive even the bureaucracy that we felt was oppressive, and we could survive those who burned away at their future until it had disintegrated. What helps then did we have of learning new skills? In fact, the skills we were learning were vital to our communication practice of discussions. We were seeing that our self-pity had been planted by those who sought to take advantage. We had resolved our issue with a white-collar dispute that meant you were working for a paycheck. We let down our guard, and for once, and we no longer needed to be supermen and women. Our roles as individuals in society would not necessarily imply that we had won the battle without even thinking about others. It would imply that we could raise the level of what we considered to be intelligible standards, so that issues of racism, sexism, and the conscious awareness of stereotyping could be seen at a level of observation and take into account the disregard for humanity that we tried to pursue in our groups. It was the appreciation of characterization that we tried to employ, not the humor in the idiosyncrasies by assaulting one's vulnerabilities. We could define our happiness then not so much as a gift of our finding pleasure in popularity, but as the accomplishment of having understood the conditions of a given situation and circumstance, and our ability to draw inference from the evidence provided, in order to learn from our own self-assessment, how to proceed in a manner to help establish our own edification. We were not practicing turning the other cheek to be hit twice as hard. In fact, we were seeing how we had taken humor and stock in ignorance. The communication skills we were learning were not merely of being open, honest, and willing. It was our first attempts at being self-critical in addressing those we influenced, and those we were influenced by. It was the first time we did not owe an apology for believing in ourselves, and that our experiences were valid, and self-evident of the fact that we viewed our lives from the standpoint of self-respect. On a reading of the Apology of Socrates, by Plato, to my English discussion group, we heard with open ears how a great leader was being tried by thousands of citizens for questioning a theological state. Socrates' claim was that the will of God was to do good, and to seek pleasure in self-attainment. That education was this highest good, and the acquisition of knowledge to be the end that consumes all of man's affairs. The group listened patiently with inquiring ears, and asked themselves if their trust in God was to include, or evade the subject of learning. How does one become a teacher to a state this large, and find he has to excuse himself with a life sentence for trusting that insight was the will of God? My English class was in a moral disarray as to questions of the value of knowledge. One voice stemmed out from the others that so often he was expected to understand what he was told based on the premise of the source in which it came. Our experiences were filled with an overwhelming feeling of threat that if we did not apply ourselves to studying, a great punishment would come our way. Yet how were we ourselves like Socrates, by teaching others the skills that were based on the disposition that they come from a God-given talent? Our answers were manifold. The skill of education reaches a vital influence that helps us to adapt all of our actions to suit our needs. This self-interest then is conducted with an aim in mind of improving our general welfare and our condition of self-will. That to be taught, or to be teachable, was an act of sheer patience. It was the willingness that prevailed when we found that our solitary acts of righteousness did not achieve the results we sought. It was the fact that there was no rational apology that could be made for instructing others on learning principles, at which point Socrates surrendered to the state and accepted his punishment. What was the state of rational thinking that Socrates had mentioned? Clearly defined as an approach to understanding the nature of the elements that are in our nature. The rational mind we accepted was one that did not have to resort to escapism, crime, or violence. It was one that transcended all claims on how one should conduct their affairs. It was above insult, and the denigration of those we felt persecuted by their taking advantage of our disadvantage. The rational mind was our restitution that we could complete the premise from which notions were found on the likeness of man to God. It was the understanding that our rational mind comprised of a spirit in which all energy prevailed, and that as living beings our responsibility to educate our minds was an act of appreciation for the body and soul that were given by God. Our trial with being teachers opened up a different experience, being that our world of resources had amounted to very little. Our clear thinking was addressed by the problems we faced to conform into a society that depreciates the moral disposition that would help us to learn from our experience. There was no easy solution to why we felt more punished by ignorance rather than the interaction amongst members of our community and society who supported our reasoning and advancing our ability to grasp notions and concepts to derive meaning from them. The end result was one of believing innocence to excuse that irrational thinking that we had no one to help us find an outlet for our intellect. It was clear that our development was in persistent battle with trial and error, that made all attempts seem futile, and the recourse helpless. To our understanding then it was the sheer envy and jealousy which in Socrates' case was met as an act of rebellion that stood in the way of seeking refuge in what would prove to be a higher good. We had to understand the value of the aims of our discussions if we were going to put away that old foolishness and idle time that made every man a dreamer. We could not seek the acceptance of conditions that isolated even our own intuition, and still feel we had arrived at a safe haven. The ability to understand points being made about the departure one has to be brave enough to endure, to impart on his fellow man the rudiments in which all fundamental needs are based on cohesion, and comprehension helped us to abandon the old myths, that the state defended against Socrates. That being compliant was an end to itself whereas it merely served the purpose and function of each member of society joining in to enact a role. Who stood at the pedestal that we could not step up to. Amongst our overture of retention, our sorrow was of being both blessed and cursed, the day the music died. Would we not be able to account for human error, given the trials and tribulations of seeing man in the image of his Creator? The fear we could no longer overcome, was that we were not provided with the tools to meet our experience with the self-knowledge that all things being equal, our priorities were not of one to give ourselves to an understanding of human nature. The choices we had made were whimsical, and based on defects and deficiencies. The trials and tribulations of own dismissal of the task at hand created a block that we would not penetrate, as a kind of forbearance stood in the way of our aim in what we had set out to accomplish. What then did we have left to hold to the light? An inspired motive to achieve tasks, that could only be defined by a self-righteousness that we did not possess. Was it not human to see the error of his ways and make amendments to hold himself accountable? The muse we had so direly believed in gave way to a glass that was half empty. What of the upstanding ridicule of the propaganda given to society? Could we not walk away from the tears of ricotta competition without forfeiting what had been an initial acquisition? What then was the emotional motivation for staring into a blank slate, and having nothing but resentment for the inability to resolve conflicts? Was a man of 1,000 faces more agile in his trickery of what presented itself as character development? What of the manipulation based on personal records, and of he who held us accountable for the unjustified sifting of thousands who grew in potential? Were we not on trial ourselves, for choosing a hardcore passion that set us deeply into paranoia? Why could we not take up a written passage and see the redeeming quality of its merits based on their virtue? The more persistent question was how long were we going to find fault in those who did not view our accomplishments as divinely inspired? What selfishness had to be overturned, before we could see that efforts when properly motivated were virtuous? How were we going to keep finding fault in the belief of others that took precedence in their own motivations? Who did we expect to clean up our mess of our own choice to drop out? How we would wail in depression holding the world accountable for our sin? Who then could we turn to with such questions as the interdisciplinary method of finding value in self-awareness that was based on a practice of self-perception? Who were we trying to bluff when the tables turned and we had lost at the game of deceit? Our motive had to resort to re-evaluating our conscience, a credit of being a philosopher. To see man as an image of God meant understanding the will could be turned to the use of good orderly conduct. We had to stop this victimizing role of being deprived of the tools to show the proper use of the will. It was our labor to hold in regard those teachings that revealed the epiphany that human nature is one that resolves conflict by reaching a solution. We had to adopt the practice of making problem-solving a psychological value that we could ascribe to a cognitive skill. How bitterly we had dismissed the teaching of the intellect. How persistently we tried to change the value of an honor system to one that was given to an abandonment of self-respect. To understand the value of understanding that the process of learning is open to self-questioning, and to questioning our motives. We had to look past the mortification of the dead, and turn over a new leaf of pessimism and optimism, while we could rely on the contrition that spoke to us in a soft voice that would reinforce that the benefit of learning is a gift of human nature that brings him closer to his own redemption. The wasted time of appealing for someone to take care of our problems for us. The naivety of looking to an all-knowing source of all of our indemnities had to be abolished. Its self-reliance meant nothing more than understanding the difference between good and evil. I asked the group to look at their own actions that were based on cause and effect, and to show us by providing evidence how the results they had achieved had miraculously brought on this resolution, but was also part of a two-sided coin which required that further action be taken to align our motivation with this practice of self-questioning. In my teaching of adult literacy in a day treatment program, the setting was quite different from what would be teaching a class in a university. The priorities were different. While many came to show up for mental health and did not relate to the literary discussion as their own fundamental need, I had to take a moment while preparing the class to organize the questions differently. The assault on character and the conflicts that had placed on in this facility attributed to a great deal of the undermining of our character. Rather than posing a question as to what purpose there is in achieving the highest good, I had to ask questions about our moral bankruptcy. If there were no lessons to be learned, and if our moral values had been eliminated, I had to evaluate from which point of departure we could begin to see exactly what happened, what the situation had been, and what the results of our actions amounted to. Would a lesson on direct and indirect pronouns be as vital in this setting, or did we need to take a look at, and take inventory in our own responsibility? From what we had learned from the institutions of corrections, were we anything but naive and ignorant who could not understand the way our own minds worked? For the class of discussion I asked what the value was in seeing that their point of view, if it meant establishing a basis in which their will could conform to taking steps in the right direction. That their understanding of sound moral reasoning may be all that it took to understanding their role in the actions that followed their behavior. We could not change the past, we could not bring the living back from the dead. Taking into consideration who we believed would set an example of what rational thinking could achieve, and yet seeing the results of the misfortune of this prodigy, we had to ask ourselves by what understanding could we achieve a rational reference point from which to begin our own footwork into literary and literacy accredited value. Our misapprehension in false predictions in regards to whom were going to become our teachers, again left us with the determination that we had misjudged the self-assertions that there were those who were cut out for academics while others were not. With whom then could we not find guilt? We had to assess this measure of guilt and remorse for feeling like the slaves who were set free without any moral ground from which to construct a life. We had no claim as to the teaching we followed, since the recourse into false determinations had proved that we had carried out our will for vengeance by taking our motives too far. We sat amongst each other disappointed once again that we had to begin even our lessons on success and failure with a blank slate, since there were no longer others who could set the example that we were convinced would be provided, in spite of our attempts to stand in their way. At this point we had successfully defeated our own purpose, and we had to think directly about our own moral viewpoint in questioning what were we trying to achieve in learning English. I asked the class to describe the loss. We have nothing to lose but our chains, I continued. Who or what did we have left to believe in? What were the positive and negative consequences of taking matters into our own hands? Did we belong confined to single bed with the treatment of corrections that promised we could never achieve freedom? The question began a discussion on what our victimization felt like, when going back to our treatment from our parents, and even the treatment they received. Could we still believe in inspiration, knowing that what happens is how our difficulty in organizing our thoughts made it increasingly difficult to survive even rehabilitation? The point is, we grew in equality in seeing the varying episodes in which an authority figure or role determined the result of what had been our actions. We saw so clearly that we were taking our first steps of powerlessness for the first time, all over again. We had to be able to cooperate in a tone of setting priorities that would include that we could demonstrate a proper use of the will. For our purpose at this point the interaction must continue, but to re-evaluate the questions I was asking, I began asking if they had an ability to grow and develop when their freedom was removed from them. At this point I saw very clearly that our need to establish a sense of values that was based on humanity was a very real need of mankind, and not one that could be determined by being convinced that there were others who showed promise, but who aroused negative discourse. We began to reveal the horror of being left without a soul. I saw for the first time that it was my responsibility to fill this huge hole that had placed us in a position of disbelief. Imperative to the points we were making, we needed to assess and understand learning. What was this concept of learning, and what did it refer to by definition? We didn't know. In our struggle to relate to this concept, we began by asking if the concept of learning was based on building ideas. That by assimilating our thinking we could work together to achieve a framework for which task achievement was possible. Was learning a concept that was based on the opening of doors, meaning that our reading skills could help us to understand cultural differences, and provide insight into personality conflicts? Were we to resume at our desk with the flow of points being made to grasp concepts that were universal? It seemed our final goal was to provide philosophical insight in which we could string together these artifacts of insight and intuition to show with scholarship that our humanity depends on understanding the intellect. Yet this was not quite our experience in achieving the goals we had accomplished in the field of literacy. Could we thus say we were faced with notions, some of which were inherently correct while others were clearly mistaken? What of beliefs? Could we sit back and judge each other on account of our beliefs by pointing out that the logic of ascribing human nature as a political animal, as a fact that we were faced to reconcile with? Could we assimilate all of our opinions to form a single statement that summarized our whole view and outlook on global issues? Was it then to be said that there was indeed that person who could explain a more logical truth, whereby his reasoning could not be disputed with to be met with fallacy? What then were the morals that could be proven or accepted? Our group decided it was not our way of thinking that was in error, yet we did answer the question that learning is an integral fundamental characteristic of human beings. Yet found fault in the answer that someone had an answer to our state of condition that made more sense, and was based on a logical conclusion of generalizing human experience. The concept of learning was then to include our human interaction, in which one member voices the tone of human understanding. Thus to account for all things being relevant to a moral disposition, we had to account for our judgment in setting priorities, and our capacity to express genuine emotion that reveal our inner nature, and our human spirit. Yet this being based on a more metaphysical state of experience, we could not define intelligence or the assimilation of concepts, to be accredited to the superstition, or concepts of self-righteous indignation. Yet we could agree that we learn from each other those concepts for which we could not frame a clear understanding. It was the potential to show our integrity by developing insight based on this understanding. Yet we could not clearly define learning as a spirit or taboo, some of which should not be understood by personality types. Our conclusion was that the voice of reason had to be based on the ability to form clear concepts that included the whole of human experience. Learning then as defined was the ability to reason intelligibly utilizing our thoughts, intuition, creativity, expressions, and motivations. That a clarity that is developed by the illumination of its integrity clearly shows the potential to understand a direct application in forming solutions. That while we could not ascribe the concept of learning to any single pedagogical aim, we could understand as the process in which our behavior, our thought process and our reasoning are understood by recognition, and reinforcement of the patterns of behavior that were mental, physical, emotional, and psychological. That somehow the decisive factor that was included in our learning had to be set by human experience as tangible evidence, that to ascribe this order to rational thoughts there had to be demonstrations and examples that were highly inferential, in which our thought patterns could adapt to an applied reasoning. One that was inclusive of the lesson learned, and that demonstrated points of evidence. The potential to learn as demonstrated by Descartes had to be based on the fact that we were human beings. That the understanding of stages of development had to be reconciled with in order to form questions in which we could reach our own solutions. This meant that as an action, the act of learning precluded our own understanding of human potential in a way in which we could raise the level of human insight so that we could make sense of it. By its own inherent value the act of learning was sensible and practical, since it develops by the vital needs of human beings to grow and develop. On a trip to the County Cullen branch of the New York Public Library on 136th Street and Lenox Avenue, we began our trip at the program by completing a worksheet on the books we would like to read. Why we felt this was a relevant reference, and why we felt the public library was a resource that was both reliable and valid. We piled onto a bus, and came in as a group, as we were welcomed by a tour guide who was there to introduce herself to my adult literacy group. She asked what we were studying as they all replied books, as she discussed the central relevance and importance of why, and how the public library serves its community, and who is welcome to make use of it. Questions came from the group, if tutoring was available, and if the library was a resource for studying for civil service exams. The tour guide explained that the library provides many educational programs, that reading and writing for literacy was one of the main objectives of providing the services, and enriching one's experience in the public sector of our city's cultural heritage community was another reason why authors and patrons would come together to read their work at the New York Public Library. We were first shown the computer area, where it was explained that the school curriculum now operates with full use of the computer, and that students make use of the public library more than ever by completing their technology-based assignments. It was also explained that many job applications were now on the web, and that to be hired one had to sit at a computer to post their resume to an employer. Yet technology itself was the main scope of how libraries have most recently come together to serve their community, as all people who take their work from home to study references that relate to their work were using the computers in the library as a resource to develop their skills in working towards their goals. Still, one student of mine was explaining that he finds technology-based skills difficult because his reading habits were too underdeveloped, that he liked reading books because it gave him a sense of time and space, and helped him to adjust his moods to the employment of being involved in his area of interest, and the books he read. We were then taken through the African American collection that had relevant resources on all fiction and non-fiction types. A student replied that this type of material interests him the most in furthering his reading skills, since he could relate to the text based on his prior experience. As we walked through the entire downstairs, we were shown the chart of all the different subjects of study that the library has as a resource, and how the books are shelved by category, and that it was possible to ask a librarian for a recommendation in reading material that is relevant to one's own interest. It was then explained that the reference books could be used to study for exams such as the graduating equivalency, and civil service exams. The tour guide took us upstairs to show us the new bilingual sections that was collecting books in different languages. She explained that the books were being supplemented by a kind of language lab that they were developing, where one could listen to both the text and the translation by listening to the audiobooks that were offered for instruction. Many of my students spoke Spanish with a basic understanding of its literal meaning. The librarian explained that bilingual classes in English as a second language were being offered to the community because of its major native Spanish-speaking community. The question came from the group if being a student of English as a second language is at all limiting of the resources that would be available to them. While they were compelled to defend the authentic Hispanic cultural heritage, they would feel that the resources they had just seen may also be in their interest, and that they would like to learn English usage from a broader perspective. Many people learn to read and write in both languages using the language lab, and while the answer was certainly no, they would not be any more limited in any way by the resources as an ESL student. The language lab provided scholarly readers which by recommendation could help them progress in their translatable skills more rapidly than attempting to pick up material at random. As we were leaving the library, and thanked the tour guide, we made note of the history section and the section on American government, as I confirmed that much of the material that I used to generate discussion in our groups came from historical experiences, our experience with democracy, and the struggle for civil rights that produced so many great philosophical thinkers. The class came together in our discussion of the quality of life. I explained to them that some of the topics for discussion implemented archetypes and themes of storytelling which have been utilized since our cultural heritage ancestry began. I posed the question if life was good or bad. Some felt it was all good, some felt it was a mixture of both. Our universal agreement was that we share common experiences was a good starting point for what makes us individuals. Our past was not our enemy. We agreed that our prior experiences and knowledge qualified us in a shared experience to some degree in the things that would make our lives complete. Each of us had had experiences leading to victimization, yet when our discussion turned the theme of having a broken heart, there was gratitude for the understanding they developed while their life was in a crisis, as the group felt comfortable with the process and stages one must get through to recover from having one's heart broken. In their eyes, such a circumstance seemed to be the only pain that was worthwhile. The next question came up when I asked if we were all followers or leaders. Some said they follow the example of just a few, and only those who they deeply respect. Others said it was in their intention to lead, but without the means to do so. They were oftentimes simply misunderstood. The question of bullying came up at this point in reference to the topic, when asked if we ever submitted to a worse form of domineering personality because at the time we felt defenseless. This introduced the question of personality type, when one contributor submitted that a person may learn from their experience and what works for them, and what doesn't. That a certain personality type may learn from being bullied to stay away from such situations to become more independent thinkers. The class agreed they had all seen cases of bullied people who overcame their weakness to achieve their dreams, and yet that, in their eyes, still did not justify the act. Yet it was a question of perception, as to whom a person feels they can either trust or distrust to become motivated. The question of quality of life still stirred as the opinion that life is a good thing was unanimous. Maybe we were neither leaders or followers all, or even most of the time, but our shared experiences qualified that there we could exercise judgment, that we had developed a level of understanding almost in spite of our reaching maturity. That the hole in the do-not was filled. We did not require the approval of others to feel our feelings, or to form a point of view based on the premise that we had had these experiences ourselves. So then how could life also be bad? The reply came back that they felt abandoned by all different classes of people, and that even their own families had voiced disapproval, and a desire that we could do better. It was when our personality successes and failure were somehow manipulated into a form of character assassination by others that we were defeated with no hope in joining those who seemed to be achieving their goals. We actually felt their arrogance was manipulated to make us feel inferior to them. At this point we felt we had no hope at all, and our resources established by a certain sense of guilt made our ability to be compassionate limited. Depression was a characteristic described by the group that made life feel worse, and made our attempts difficult in modeling our behavior to take the necessary actions to come out of. Thus then we all ascribed being emotionally motivated as a sign of integrity. That the quality of our own lives was very much the cause of our own making. That cause and effect in relation to behavioral norms and expectations oftentimes set us up for a lesson to be learned. In fact, as we as taking initial actions, we agreed that life was filled with these many lessons that ascribed characteristic traits to ourselves as individuals. It was in this broader sense that I attempted to tie the conversation into literacy. As we had discussed the various themes that make our lives complete, I demonstrated that conflict resolution, and cause and effect like reading and writing skills, had everything to do with working through thought processes in our own mind, in order to develop it in a way that shows our experience is meaningful and relevant, to whom we are as people, and the points of view we establish, based on the situations and circumstances we have lived through. The process in which a group can agree that literacy skills and the development attribute to a condition of wisdom, was very much the motivational theory I implemented to show them that their reading skills were effective. To speak of the class as drives, instincts and incentives, meant providing examples as to how in recompense they were already becoming storytellers. They were becoming storytellers of their own intellect, like depicting pictographs of their own illusions as to the chemistry that functions with critical thought. My position was not to argue that they were disabled only as far as their minds would have them tell them so, while they had gathered from inference the fundamentals and models they needed to make their contribution. The contribution of my students was made to the whiteboard as sentences that had cultural influences about their heritage. Diverging viewpoints and differentiating forms of argument cast into our discussion what they enjoyed about reading, but that time they felt out of place doing so. To develop an emotional integrity and an emotional balance we needed to side with our feelings of guilt and shame, in an effort to take ownership of them. That the preceding knowledge that had arisen by contributing insight had to find its center in its own positive influence. Everything else was just playing games, while we felt comfortable enough discussing the shortcomings of intimidation to develop a plan to make use of the thought processes that were established by discussing a storyline. The characteristics that made us individuals received the affirmation that there was very little conflict with our own identity, and how we envisioned this to be portrayed in the world of social media. The themes that took priority in our own independent thinking were very much the strands of reinforcement that we encountered by discussing reading material. So that at least we established the point that there was no conflict in our own identities and these literacy skills that were developing. I used as a moral example that of the prodigy child returning home. How then did we feel returning to our mentors or perhaps our families to submit that we were rational, philosophers, musicians, poets, and literary scholars? What was the dream deferred in making the comment that we had the incentive to struggle with scholarly leaders to show that our inbred gifts were highly intuitive? When did that last glimmer of hope die, as we were practiced our last skills of the intellect? In having a lack of resources in knowing where to find the reliable teacher, our thoughts still perpetuated rebellion, as we were shown that learning skills develop from personal incentives. That when the student is ready the right teacher will present themselves. It was then that we could feel our emotional balance was the outcome of accepting that we had minds of our own, that could and would work when given a chance to. I took note of these many incentives and developed a kind of hierarchy. That placed family on the bottom. Academic skills second. Personal interests third. communication skills fourth, and fifth, but on top were our own incentives. It was this hierarchy that we used to derive conclusions about the placement of support and when we could allow one stage to follow the next in a kind of synchronicity. It was an understanding that our most primal needs were one to instill diverse thinking, to grasp concepts of sound reasoning that were based on the premise that they could add to our contribution. From this class discussion one student added that we were working with a status quo. It is not to say we weren't, but it was more important to find where the support came from, that would make these stages of development one worth investing time in. No one likes to feel like an outcast who is simply misdirected. The point of our letter and our reworking of sentences was so that we could describe the situations and circumstances that had defeated us with enough distance from them, so that our insight into rational concepts could show how each step of the way we were taking stock in our own recovery from them. The bulk of our works was clarified as we found these threads that would make the universal experience of being human to complete more characteristic thoughts of our incentives, based on our own discussions about our own integrity as a personal matter, in such a way that we did not have to sacrifice having the incentive to develop sound reasoning based on the irrational claim that this was meant for other people. Basing my teachings on moral principles while working in conjunction with the teachings of the Quaker Society of Friends, I asked my class the question: what value? What moral value, and what ethical principle will they take with them from our teaching of adult literacy? The response was that they would use the class as their lesson that they learned, that they could understand their prior knowledge now, as a premise and perception of self-awareness. The reply was made that they were coming from a reference point of being lost at sea, and survivors of their own shipwreck. That they now felt they could explore and discover more about themselves, by researching this uncharted island, to learn from its inhabitants how their experience was of value, and how they could make ready plans that could be followed by action in demonstrating that what they learned were very fundamental facts of human nature. Men and women, we concluded, was made in the image of their Creator. That this creativity in our own creations, were very much a response that made this cognitive domain, one of a versatile critical-minded thought process that was inferential in understanding points of our own conflicts, and resolutions of them. That cause and effect, as well as comparing and contrasting arguments for agreement, was very much the practice of sound reasoning. That in the image of our Creator, we could construct hypothetical and theoretical statements that were both reliable and valid. That our personality traits, our very assets and liabilities, no longer constrained us to a point that we needed the approval from others, to construct from our past the significance and dignity of being accountable for the moral value found in self-expression. And that literacy was the taproot in which this foundation could lead to a promise of hope. The question of authority then became the turning point in our self-searching, as we decided amongst ourselves, that for our group purpose we were still very much our own authority. That men and women were very much self-governing, with the ability to take into account supporting evidence that served the function of decision-making actions that were both productive and intuitive. In fact, the resolution of our own productivity was the stock and barrel of our own safekeeping on pride. That when task analysis had been achieved we were the source of our own inner strength, and self-confidence. That there was no reason to stay isolated in a world that just seems to transgress progress. Our own progress was very much our own responsibility, for which we could develop a more common form of this need to be productive in a way that is liberating. In asking what the decision was about the original question, the point was clarified that the class had taken ownership of its own literacy skills. That the previous motivation was more cutthroat, and presumably another plan for a hit and run. So what did they mean by ownership of their skills? As it turned out, it was the very act of their own participation and involvement with skills of intelligences that they began to heal. Without the stigma attached of what had been the cause, or submission to what was absolute failure. The class agreed that their telling of the viewpoints had very much enabled them to rise to success, that in fact they could not separate or isolate themselves from their will. That it was our intention to see to it that it be put to proper use. That we had succeeded in understanding the content of what is carried out through points of reference and expressed in points of view was clearly established by consensus. That the lesson that was of the most value, moral, ethical or otherwise, was about life. That life itself is as a current of thought. That though disabled we had the inalienable to transcend this sphere of influence, to gather from it in just which way our perspective of identity are tools to be utilized to clarify, and to theorize what is either the common or the uncommon condition that gives rise to the power of voice, and will at last be the testimony that we may reveal that our voice be heard, since it will be based on devotion, compassion, growth and development. Indeed, our own way of self-study worked fine, as the class became experts at assessing their own state of condition, in the attempt to take ownership of their own affairs. I conducted the final assessment of our class with the I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King Jr. The conclusive aim of discussion was to ask what direction does the speech take, and in what direction does it lead? The final statement of reinforcement was that ignorance was oppressive, but in a positive light we agreed that a universal love did exist. From that universal love which every person is motivated to achieve, comes a sense of self-love. This perception of self-love, without running the risk of becoming narcissistic, implies that our identities all contain a sense of wish fulfillment, and a clearly designed plan, to place the good of all human beings as our priority. Our oppression as stated came from our own illiteracy, that by becoming teachable we were now at the disposal of the thoughtful minds that would place us in the consideration and examination of motivation, self-awareness and self-expressive connotation we were ready to develop, with the skills we had learned to apply them as tools to the conscientious-minded reasoning of making our goodwill the final service for the work we were now prepared to achieve. The question of our civil rights now became defined as our inalienable rights, which meant we born into this world to be acknowledged for the fundamental aspects of human sensitivity of our own growth and development. That this was also our divine right which was at the source of all of our soul-searching. My lesson outline was published by www.scholastics.com as an orientation into the works in philosophy we would be covering in class. This benefit helped my students prepare for each careful examination of self-will, to aid us in forming our own interpersonal connectedness with group discussion which also included a writing circle, and classes on note-taking. As a reference to prepare my class to further their communication with other students who were conducting reading, writing and literary projects of their own, I referred my class to www.goodreads.com, and www.freebooknotes.com. These resources have the type of feedback and response which conducts learning projects with a positive influence. I also posted a writing gallery with the National Council of Teachers of English so that my students could observe what a writing collection gathered by the class on non-biased would appear to be when taken as a whole. Throughout the course taught at the Harlem Bay Network, my students gave rounds of applause to credit themselves for their own achievement. Resources: 1. Reggie Finlayson, We Shall Overcome 2003, Millbrook Press, North Minneapolis, MN. 2. Plato, The Apology of Socrates. 3. Descartes, Ergo Sum. 4. Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto. 5. County Cullenbrink of the New York Public Library, 136th Street and Lenox 6. Harlem Bay Network. For West 125th Street 7. www.scholastics.com 8. www.goodreads.com 9. www.freebooknotes.com